Good evening and welcome to Bronx Talk. Tonight's guest is the Comptroller of the City of New York. With threatened cuts to federal funding, a struggling housing market, all too expensive childcare, and an always looming budget negotiation, there's a lot to talk with him about. Let's get right to it. Please join me in welcoming back to Bronx Talk the Comptroller of the City of New York, the Honorable Brad Lander. Nice to have you, sir.
Great to be back, Gary. Thank you.
And we say back, but actually you were on during the pandemic, so we were all on a little box and all that, but here we are in person.
Great to be here.
Before we start, I just wanted to make one note to viewers. We know that Mr. Lander is running for mayor, but in discussion with his office personnel, we agreed we'd focus the dialogue on tonight's program about his work as Comptroller. We'll provide other opportunities to present the campaign as we get closer to June 24th, and we invite everybody to vote for their candidate of their choice. Let's start with the latest news. The confusion over President Trump's announcement that he's going to cut federal funding has now been rescinded, but of course he's sticking to it. He wouldn't fully admit, well, it's going away. In anticipation of this, last month you put out a report called Protecting New York City. This was in anticipation of what he might do.
Yes.
Where are we at? What are your concerns? What did that report say that people should know?
Yeah, so New York gets about $100 billion in total, not just the city, but New Yorkers. And the biggest chunk of that is Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare. But it goes so many places. Our city public schools, $1.5 billion. Our healthcare, H&H, so many things. And of course, they said that they would exempt individual programs, but food stamps is a block grant. So if this had been gone through, and they might still do it again, we're talking of people not having their food stamps, not having their Head Start center, not having our school lunch money. And, he gave this story of like, oh, this is something about Marxism or woke, but the federal funding for childcare, for school lunches, for healthcare, that's what Americans rely on, and causing chaos. We're not going to stand for it.
I made a list out of your report. New York City Housing Authority, MTA, University of New York, Health and Hospitals Corporation, federal benefits for New Yorkers, of course, but although he said he wouldn't affect individuals, the SNAP program, emergency funding, et cetera, et cetera. So what do you do, and what does your report suggest that, how can we protect New York City? Because these are important things for New Yorkers.
Absolutely. Well, yesterday my first call was to New York State Attorney General Tish James, and she went right into court and filed for an injunction. She's the lead attorney general representing all the other state attorneys general suing to block this. It's illegal, that memo. The president doesn't have the authority to do what's called impound or block funds that Congress has already authorized to be spent. There's a law called the Impoundment Control Act of 1974. So Tish James went into court, others went into court. And fortunately, by the end of the day, the administration had walked it back. But we have to stay ready because they could bring it.
And ready to do what? Go through the courts or restructure the funding, which of course, please come up with $100 billion, Mr. Comptroller.
Yeah. Look, there are some narrow areas where we might be able to restructure. So if they were to say to New York Health and Hospitals, unless you stop providing abortions, we're not going to give you your $1 billion. We might say, okay, you know what? Those abortions cost $50 million. Let's put city money up to pay for the abortion care, and then we can keep getting the $1 billion from the federal government. So sometimes there's something that you might be able to do. But no, mostly for that total $100 billion, or even just the $9.7 billion that the city itself gets. We can't let them do it, and that's why court action was important.
We'll talk about child care in a moment, but for me and my own personal priorities, the first Head Start program that gets cut, you'll see it on this program. I'll be banging.
But I already heard about one actually in the Bronx. I was talking to a developer who's building an affordable housing development, and his plan has been to put a Head Start center in the ground floor of that building.
Which is what we want. This is Gary's advocacy.
I mean, I think that's what all New Yorkers want. Grand Street Settlement is supposed to be running the Head Start Center. they had to call the developer and say, look, if this goes through, I don't know if we'll be able to sign the lease if we don't have our money.
Just as an aside, they were actually on this program. It was a grant from Congressman Torres that led to that whole dialogue. Well, we will certainly keep our eye on it. The other thing was this buyout offer of federal employees. We have federal employees, presumably, who live in New York City. Do you have a sense of, number one, what they individually might do, and number two, what would be the cost to the city of New York?
Yeah, well, let's first be clear. This is another place where what he's doing is illegal and a grift. He's done this his whole life. I would just say to federal employees, if he's saying you'll get paid for another 8 months for not working. Donald Trump lies to the workers that he fires over and over again. So I would not count on, if you say yes, thinking you're going to get paid for another 8 months, that man is not going to keep his promises to you. So, I would just urge federal employees to look really carefully at, whether he has kept his promises before, whether you
before they agree to just
because you might
resign.
hand in your resignation saying I was promised 8 months more of pay, and then they don't pay you, and you're out of luck.
We could probably spend the whole show on items that are coming out of the White House at this point. But one thing of importance is the deportation programs. If a lot of it goes through and it's still playing itself out, but what do you worry about the effect on the economy of the deportation programs? While many are migrants or undocumented, they still do some vital work in the city
Very
of
vital
New York.
work in construction, in restaurants, in delivery, in home care, in child care. A lot of that is immigrants and even undocumented immigrants. We have about 500,000 people who would be vulnerable to deportation. Many of them have DACA or temporary protective status or humanitarian parole, but he said
They don't seem
that's
to have
not
respect for
gonna
any of that.
matter.
And so, how? What happens in what industries you're concerned about? Construction industry, food care. I mean,
Yeah, these are the big ones. So
I guess I've said them.
Yes, no, but that's right. Restaurants, food, both in restaurants and food delivery, and then also in some care work, in child care, in home care. So those are all places. And of course, that would just drive prices up. He said he was going to bring prices down, but if you deport the workers doing various forms of low-wage work, the cost of those things, of housing, of health care, of food, would all go up.
Also, I guess it's not a direct financial concern, but parents are keeping their kids home from school, and it's
afraid somebody's a victim of domestic violence and afraid to go to the cops, on and on.
I have to be a Bronx guy to you. I saw the headline in the New York Times that said the city is closing two migrant shelters in Brooklyn and Queens. And I was like, oh, well, that's interesting. The program is developed. Maybe we've moved some of these people to jobs or homes or whatever. And then the small print was, by the way, they're opening a new one in our home borough, the Bronx. And of course, my reaction, and everybody in the Bronx who's familiar with this, is like, still? Again? What are your thoughts about that? Is that a useful thing for the city? Is it good? But again, Bronx, leave us alone.
We've done a lot of analysis of what we call fair share, and time and again, the Bronx has much more than its fair share, especially of shelters. Even if you look at where people are coming from, if they're homeless, still the Bronx has many more shelters than its fair share. And in this case, these giant shelters, they're proposing a 2,200 bed shelter. There's one with 4,000 people on Hall Street in Brooklyn that I've been to. It's just too big to provide the kind of, if you've got a neighborhood that doesn't have community rooms and community centers and stores and the kinds of things people need, then it doesn't work for the people in the building, and it doesn't work for the neighbors to it either.
And what do you do with them? I mean, we've got to do something. I mean, they closed down some of those facilities.
Look, there's two shelters right around the corner from my house in Brooklyn, 250 families, and they're well run by Wynn. They're working to try to help people get work authorization so they get jobs and land on their feet. So you can do this, but you have to have good providers. And unfortunately, a lot of times the administration has been doing these no-bid emergency contracts. And it's one thing to have a shelter with 200 families that you can really help. 2,200.
So that would,
too big.
I'm just walking it back a little bit. So that would require significant research to go into neighborhoods and find out places where it's, of course, everybody says not in my neighborhood. The one in your neighborhood, do you find that it's okay? Or
It is.
happy?
I mean,
because
there
it's
was-
well managed and there's
Correct.
support.
Yeah, I mean, it's a reasonable size for the building. It's in a neighborhood with a good infrastructure, community life. There's a good manager in Wynn. Look, there was a lot of concern among some of my neighbors when they opened, but I said, look, I know these guys and we have to do our fair share. And now it's been open 4 or 5 years and we've had no problems.
Did you like City of Yes and the way it came down ultimately?
We
Obviously, it was reformatted
Yeah.
somewhat.
We need more housing. We need more housing in every neighborhood. If we don't want to have people who are homeless, housing is the answer. So I support City of Yes, but that's not going to get affordable housing. That's just going to get more housing
This was going to be my next
overall.
question, of course.
And so what we got to focus on, especially in the Bronx, is housing that's affordable to people who live in this borough. I mean, one way to look at it is the median rent for an existing family in the Bronx, $1,400. The asking rent for the average unit in the Bronx is now over $3,000. So we can't just, if you just produce new units and those units are 3,000, 3,100, 3,200, that's not for someone from the Bronx. And it's even worse than that because that's why people are getting pushed out of their existing buildings.
So does City of Yes and the way it's structured provide for it? Because of course they saying all the new buildings over a certain amount have to put 20% to affordable. It's not a lot.
Look, we do need more housing overall in the New York City marketplace, and so I supported City of Yes. But that's, if you're asking me, is that going to really help Bronx families who need affordable housing? No. For that, you need something more like what I did in Gowanus, which is a rezoning in my neighborhood, which has 3,000 low-income units. We need some new models of affordable homeownership for working class families like we used to do at Co-op City and amalgamated houses. If we're going to upzone a neighborhood, let's make the new units affordable homeownership for working class families.
I remember years ago when I guess it was HBO did a special on homelessness, and George Carlin came up. He said it's not homelessness, it's houselessness, and we need to create houses for them. You put out a study, a plan to end street homelessness called Safer for All. Why don't you just let folks what that plan is and what your concept is?
Yeah, I mean, all your viewers have been seeing what's going on in the subways, and this, we just have more people since the pandemic who are homeless and mentally ill, and sometimes become a danger to themselves or to others. But we could end street homelessness for people with serious mental illness. We dug in, audited the existing programs that aren't working or just sweeping people from street to subway to hospital to jail and back again. In Salt Lake City, in Houston, in Denver, they have this model called Housing First, where instead of leaving someone on the street, you put them in an apartment, a single room occupancy, a supportive housing unit, wrap services around them, and many people who don't want to go into shelters because they've had a bad experience will take that, and 70 to 90% of the time, people remain stably housed, and we could use that program. Sometimes you do need involuntary hospitalization, secure detention, mental health court, but 70 to 90% of the time, Housing First gets it done.
The real answer in there is the supportive aspect of it.
Correct.
And not-for-profits, we have many wonderful ones in the Bronx. I think there's something like 1,200 not-for-profits in the Bronx. The economy for them is not working out so well. Certainly if federal monies dry up, we go back to that question. And that becomes an economic question. How do you keep those organizations strong so that they can keep providing those services?
Correct.
When they always have their hands out and they've got to do galas? I've moderated most of them. So anyway, that's the
Yeah,
question.
but if we don't, this is penny wise and pound foolish what we're doing, because jail and hospitals are way more expensive than supportive housing. So if we'll make the upfront investment to provide the services to people through those mental health and nonprofit organizations while they're in the supportive housing, then those folks spend fewer nights in jail, fewer nights in the ER, fewer nights in the psychiatric ward, and the city will actually save money over time.
You made a rather bold statement just a moment ago that we could end street homelessness. You really, you think the numbers work?
I do want to be careful what I did say. End street homelessness for people with serious
that's
mental
right.
illness.
Okay, that's fair.
I mean, I love to end street homelessness for everyone. Believe me, I actually did the hope count the other
Snap
night
the fingers.
and went out but we looked at how many people are we talking about who are sleeping on the street with serious mental illness, and it's about 2,000 people. In this city of 8 million, one of the richest cities in the world, we do have the room to provide for those 2,000 people single room occupancy or supportive housing units and provide the services, and we'll save money over time. The city will feel a lot better. So yes, this is realistic. You know, we used to have a lot of veterans who were sleeping on the street. We took a homeless first model,
to be honest.
and let's say we effectively ended. We basically ended street homelessness for veterans. We could do the same for folks with serious mental illness.
You know, I want to get to child care in a moment, but the mentally ill homeless people or people with mental conditions, I don't even want to go as far as to say they're ill, create fear on the subways, and we can get into the whole congestion pricing and all that stuff. Just today, I was just reading the paper before you came in. There's an IBO report on the cost of police in the subway. The governor has asked for more policing, and it's clear that they're being more visible. But they say NYPD overtime is the variable as to how much they can do and, of course, what it would cost.
Yeah.
What's your view on, is it worth to do, if we're going to spend overtime, do it there? Or is this out of control?
Well,
you're the controller.
Yes, I mean, we've looked carefully at NYPD overtime, and this year we're going to pass $1 billion in overtime. Part of the reason for that is that we're about 1,500 officers under the authorized headcount at the NYPD because we're struggling to retain officers. So I've been talking to people about what we can do just to make sure we attract and recruit and retain enough officers, because you'd much rather do it with straight time than with overtime. But again, unless you have that housing first model and actually connect people to housing and care, there's only so much the police can do. People want them in the cars, especially overnight. But if you want to get that person actually off the subway and into housing, you've got to have a program to do it.
You did a study, and all of this conversation about not-for-profits and federal funding, et cetera, you did a study about child care.
Yeah.
We did a few shows actually on that whole notion. The child care affordability and the benefits of universal provision was your study.
That's right.
We need it so badly. The costs are getting higher, are escalating. What do we need to do?
Yeah.
Where are we at?
Yeah, I mean, it's great that we do universal pre-K for 4-year-olds, and we need to get that universal 3-year-old 3K. Unfortunately, Eric Adams has fallen several thousand families short. There's about 10,000 people who wanted a 3K slot, and we weren't able to get it to them. And then, of course,
excuse me. You can tell I'm very big on early childhood education and the importance of it to our city. That's very sad. We throw out numbers. I say this all the time in the show. We throw out numbers. Do the count of how many families that is for 10,000. That's a lot.
One of them was my dental hygienist who told me about it as she was holding the Novocaine needle. And she's like, "Controller, I thought every 3-year-old was getting a slot." Now in the budget this year, the mayor's got a $300 million underfunding of child care slots just to maintain the same slots as this year. He's threatening to close 5 child care centers, including one from Grand Street Settlement and Nuestros Niños. So we did a gathering last week, and we included Bronxdale,
the Bronxdale Nursery.
Yes.
Yes.
Look, it costs a family on average $23,400. That's more than CUNY for their 2-year-old or their 3-year-old. Our working families are getting crushed by housing costs. Their jobs aren't paying enough. This is what New York City and New York State can do for them, is give them free universal child care. It'll pay off so big.
So you say the investment now, and then it pays off in the long run. That's how you would conceivably pay for it.
We need help from this. The city on its own can fund 3K, can keep those 5 centers open, can fund Promise NYC, which is child care for working immigrant families. But to go further, to get to 2-year-olds, to do more after school, we do need state funding. And there's this great campaign, New Yorkers United for Child Care. I hope people will get involved. That's fighting for a statewide universal child care commitment with the funding to match.
I understand we did have, not on this program, another BronxNet program did a segment on that. There was a study that came out just the other day about education and saying that children were not doing math. I think the reading scores, I forget for which grades, were atrocious.
Yeah.
seems to me, I'm going right into childcare and early childhood education for this. If we start them early, not only with child care, but having it be an educational thing at the age of 3, at the age of 4, they start to see words, they sit with their friends, they look at books. This is how we're ultimately going to improve those things. Listen, we want to do it through the public schools, I get that. But again, this is Gary's advocacy.
You got to start young. That's what all the evidence shows.
When you do a study like the 3 we just talked about, how much play, not only media play, but do you find that they have effect, or you put them out just to let people know what's going on?
I mean, I actually talked to 3 reporters today interested in our child care reports.
Oh, there you go.
And I take that they know what their readers are looking for. I mean, families are so hungry for this right now. And when you think about, everyone's talking about the cost of living, the cost of eggs, the cost of housing, all those things matter enormously, but childcare is a thing. First, it really hits you when you're a young family. You just had to move into new housing because your family's growing. You don't have that much income yet because you're not near your earning potential. $23,000 for your 3-year-old to have childcare, it's insane.
It is.
But it's something we could do something about, and pre-K showed it. When we said, it didn't used to be that you had a right to education for your 4-year-old, and then New York City provided it. It just shows we could do big things.
When you advocate, as you just talked about, along with people in the state who are involved with state funding, how is it received? Or is it another one of those cases, well, New York or the Bronx goes out with their hand out, and they're always looking for a handout?
Well, I was just listening to a podcast on which the state deputy majority leader, Mike Gianaris, who helps shape the agenda for the New York State Senate, was asked, what's your number 1 priority? And he said his number 1 priority that he hears from his families is childcare. And then he's hearing that all across the state. And all this talk about what Democrats need to learn from the shift toward Trump that we just saw is provide the things people need. And I really think childcare should be right at the top of the list.
I've got to ask you about congestion pricing. There was a study that came out this morning, as a matter of fact, said that 10 to 30% of the traffic is moving faster. Anecdotally, from people I talk to or downtown, et cetera, they're all saying, wow, the streets are are moving. Yeah. Are we getting where we want to be?
Well, the numbers are very encouraging from the first month. As you say, we've seen significant drops. The revenue numbers the MTA will put out soon, but I think we're on path to provide some of the revenue that's going to let us modernize our subway signals and get elevators in more of our stations, add platform barriers so people are less afraid about being pushed onto the track. So this is critical. Now, today there's news that President Trump is going to try to roll it back.
I saw that. I didn't read the whole article. I said,
it's hard to know what's
add
real.
it to the list.
Yeah, but it's working. It's reducing traffic. It's making the air cleaner. We obviously do have to look out at some of the places in the Bronx, like the Cross Bronx Expressway, and make sure that we're not seeing induced traffic there. So I want to see those numbers.
Speaking of that, I didn't think about bringing that up, but of course that's going to be a lot of federal funding needed for that whole project. That's another whole thing. The real question, aside from moving traffic, okay, we can figure out how to move, you tell people it's going to cost them more, of course they're going to stay home. But will that money get to where it needs to go so that the real benefit is to increase, all of the things that the MTA needs?
Look, that's the promise, and that we have to hold them to it. The MTA has started putting numbers out about traffic reductions. They need to put numbers out about elevators that have been installed and are working, about subway signals that have been modernized and so trains are running on time, about platform barriers and station gates so people are safer. The reason to do this partly to reduce congestion, but even more in my mind to invest in our subways and buses for the vast majority of working New Yorkers who need them. And people have to see that, and then the MTA has to connect the dots and show them that is your congestion pricing money at work.
I saw a very realistic profile of a woman who is a cellist with, I guess, for Broadway shows. And she lives in Lower Westchester, modestly it would seem. She lives in Hartsdale. And she said, I have been driving my car into the city. My problem is with, and I have no problem taking the train. There's an efficient train. I can get to Midtown, obviously, very quickly. She said, but at the end of the shows end at maybe 10 o'clock or 10:30. By the time I get out there, I need a train at 11:30 so I can get out, but there aren't enough trains. There aren't enough. So that's another thing that I think people aren't thinking about, that it's just as important to do that kind of infrastructure for the suburbs.
Absolutely. Look, we have regional rail systems, and we need to make them stronger. You know, we should probably integrate PATH with the subway, and then you could have a one-seat ride to Newark. So yes, whether you live in Westchester, Long Island, or Jersey, we want you integrated into our mass transit.
And I'm certainly hoping that the 4 Metro North stations we're getting are going to assist in that whole
Hear,
effort.
hear.
Listen, we got about 2 minutes. I mentioned the budget negotiation. Of course, the budget doesn't get due till the end of the spring. What are your priorities now? Or when they say, Mr. Controller, what should we work on? What are you going to talk to council members and even the mayor about?
So priority one is that $300 million shortfall in childcare that we already talked about. The mayor's underfunded childcare by $300 million just to keep the childcare we already have, so we need that. Affordable housing is obviously such a big issue, and HPD is struggling even when a new unit comes online to get people in it. So we've got to do more there, and then we do have to save.
Let's just break down for 1 second.
Yeah.
So how would city money go toward getting us more affordable housing?
Yeah, well, I'll give you one
way?
very specific example. It used to be that once an affordable housing unit got built, it only took 2 months to have a person move in. HPD is understaffed. It's now taking 8 months. So for 6 months, we're leaving the unit vacant, hire a few people at HPD to review the application,
and you had
get people into the
You
homes.
had 1 or 2 other items you wanted to mention.
So we are underfunding the city's rainy day fund, and
Which we're going to need.
We are going to need, and we've been calling for that every year.
Brad Lander, New York City Controller, thank you so much.
Thank
we
you.
could go on.
We could.
The monies in New York City are central to all of us. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
And we'll see you around town, I'm sure, especially as we get close to election time. We thank our producer. It's Rebecca Hemick. Our director is Will Guzman. Urelis Encarnacion is on graphics. Ian Neville is on audio. Editor, Yenelsida Diaz. We got the cast of thousands around us here in the studio. And of course, to you too, the most important, the people of the Bronx. So if the curtain don't fall and the creek don't rise, I'll be back next week. Good night. Stay there.
This was great.